So now we already learned quite a bit about effects. To finish this part about effects here, I now want to add a second effect which actually loads the data from local storage. And this is now an effect that should then actually dispatch a new action once it's done. A new action that will take that counter that was extracted from local storage and store it in our NGRX store, so that when we basically reload the app, we continue with the counter we stored before. To make this all work, I need to add two new actions though. I need one new action, which could be called init, which should in the end trigger this side effect pipeline that reaches out to local storage and loads data from it. For this, I'll create it here with create action, or of course also with this alternative syntax. But here I'll use create action and give it this identifier. And here I don't need any extra payload. I don't need any extra data attached to the action. But I'll then add a second action here, which I'll simply name set, also created with create action, where the identifier should be counter set, but where I now do want to have some value attached to it again, and the value here should again be the number to which we set the counter. And therefore again here I'll add this kind of shape for the data that is attached to the action. With these two actions added, I have one action now that will trigger the side effect, and one action that should be dispatched once the side effect is done to then be handled in the reducer. Therefore, I'll start in the reducer actually and add another on branch to it, so to say, where I now listen for the set action, which again should be dispatched once we loaded data with help of our side effect. And here I then got my state and my action, and I know that my action will carry the data to which the state should be set. Therefore here I simply return action.value. I don't even care about the existing state. Instead, I'll set my state to the payload that is attached to the action, because that will be the counter value that will be retrieved from local storage. But of course, we now have to add the logic for this. And for this, back here in counter effects, we can add a new property, load count, with help of create effect. And we again pass our function to create effect, where we build another effect pipeline with help of this actions pipe. And then here we pass off type here to define for which kind of action this pipeline should be executed. And here that's for the init action, which must be imported from the actions file. And we'll make sure to dispatch this action from somewhere in our application soon. So with that, we got the filter, and here it's only one action that should trigger this side effect, so other actions will not trigger it. And for example, the init action would not trigger this side effect here, this save count side effect, because here we're only listening for increment and decrement actions. But in the load count side effect pipeline here, we then wanna continue by getting some data from our local storage. And for this, we can use the switch map operator offered by RxJS, which simply allows us to switch to a new observable chain, where we then start by getting some value from local storage. And for that, we want to use local storage get item and get the item stored under the key count, because that's the key I'm using down here for storing the value. So that's then my stored counter. And then the new value we want to return here should be a new observable that in the end is wrapped around an action we want to dispatch. And for that, we can simply call set. So this set action, which is imported from the actions file, which creates such an action object. And here I then set the value equal to my stored counter. However, here I want to convert this to a number, and therefore I'll add a plus in front of it. Now, stored counter could be null if no value is found under that key, and therefore I'll actually add an if check and check if stored counter is truthy, in which case I'll return this action wrapped around this counter, converted to a number. Alternatively, I'll execute set with a value of 0. So if we have no counter stored yet, we'll just start with 0 as a counter value. So with that, we're almost there, but switch map actually needs an observable to be returned by this function and not an action object. And therefore, we should turn this action object into an observable by using the of operator, which is imported from RxJS, which is simply a function we can execute to wrap it around a value, which will then be wrapped into an observable. And with that, switch map is happy once I wrapped both action objects with of. And with that, we also finished this effect pipeline, which will now load some data from local storage and which will then in the end dispatch a new action once it's done. And therefore here, since this pipeline does in the end yield a new action object, which is the default for NGRX effects, which is kind of expected by NGRX effects, we should not add this dispatch false configuration object to create effect. That was only required before for this pipeline, where we did indeed not yield a new action object as a final result. Here that's different, so we don't set dispatch to false. And with that, we're almost there. We now just have to make sure that this init action gets dispatched somewhere so that this pipeline gets started. And of course, it's not up to you where you want to initialize your app. Here, for me, I would say it makes sense to do this in the app component, because I know that this demo app needs a counter, so I want to dispatch this initializing action as early as possible. Therefore, I'll implement onInit here in the app component, and then add ng-onInit, this ng-onInit function here, so that in here we can dispatch this action. For that, of course, we also should inject the store by also importing ngrx store like this, so that inside of ng-onInit we can use this store to call dispatch and dispatch this init action by calling this init function, which is imported from the counter actions file. And here we don't pass any data to init because the init action indeed is an action that does not require any extra data. So with that, we're dispatching this basically when the app starts, and that then kicks off this side effect pipeline here, which loads data and dispatches another new action, which is then handled by the reducer. And that should load any already stored counter when our app runs. So if you now save all files and you run ngserve, if you restart the app, you should indeed start with the counter that was already stored in local storage. And if you change that counter and you restart, you should start with that updated counter. If you delete that value from local storage, you should start with 0, but then as soon as you changed it again, that value gets stored and gets used for follow-up restarts of the app. And of course, it should be needless to mention, but this code works no matter if you're using Angular modules or standalone components. So I'll copy over all that code from the reducer effects and actions files into the standalone Angular component, and also use that app component code in the standalone component here, though there, of course, I must make sure that I don't lose standalone and my imports, so I will actually just copy the constructor and ng-onInit into the app component and implement onInit here, and also add that onInit import, and of course also add the imports of init and store. So these lines of code are also required here. And with all that, of course, if we give this a try and we start this application here with standalone components, we still load that counter, change it, save that counter, and restart with that saved counter. And that's how you can use NGRX effects. So that's now it for this introduction to NGRX. You now learned about all these core building blocks that are required when working with NGRX. You also learned about NGRX effects, and you're therefore now able to use this state management solution in your Angular applications instead of storing your state with help of services or components, which, and that's really important, is not wrong or bad. But for more complex applications that are way more complex than this demo app which I used for introducing you to NGRX, using a solution like NGRX can make your code more manageable and a bit easier to understand in the end. Now in this section here, there's still a lot of content to come though, because I originally recorded this section with an older version of NGRX, and I used this recipe book project which we built in this course to implement NGRX and to teach you NGRX. Therefore, the rest of this section uses this slightly older version of NGRX, but you can still use the shown code there. Because all the things I teach you in this section, in the remainder of this section, still apply and all my explanations still make sense, hopefully, but I'm not using create reducer or create action, but instead I'm creating the actions as I showed it to you a couple of lectures ago, and I'm creating the reducers as I showed it to you a couple of lectures ago. And I'm creating my effects with help of this add effect decorator, which is not supported anymore, where you should switch to create effect instead. Nonetheless, I did not delete these old lectures because they might still be valuable to you. They do show you NGRX in the context of this recipe book app after all, and I also made sure to attach multiple code snapshots two different lectures, which I did also update to a more recent version of NGRX, so that it should be easy for you to also follow along with that latest version of NGRX by simply using these attached code snapshots, which you find on some of those later lectures. Therefore, you can of course ignore the rest of this section because you already did get an introduction to NGRX now, but if you want to see it in action on a slightly bigger project, I would recommend that you do follow along, maybe at double speed, because of course I will also explain some things about which you already learned, but I would recommend that you still take this as an extra exercise and practice, and as some extra content that might still be interesting to go through.